Welcome to Researching Statutes, Part 3, Basic Statutory Research in Westlaw. This is a tutorial by the Jerome Hall Law Library at Indiana University Maurer School of Law. In this tutorial, you'll learn how to navigate to a jurisdiction's statutory code, how to locate the code's index and popular name table, how to search a code for relevant code sections, how to locate historical information about the code section, and where to find annotations as well as information from Westlaw's Citator. You can access Westlaw by navigating to the Law Library's website, going to Research Tools, and clicking on the button that says Westlaw Edge. You'll then need to log yourself in and access Westlaw Edge. From the main landing page, there are several ways to go about finding statutes. You can use the main search bar and then filter for statutes after you search. But when I know I want to search the statutory code of a particular jurisdiction, I prefer to navigate to the code first and then search. To do this, use the links in this middle box. You can click on Statutes and Court Rules and then choose a jurisdiction, or you can click to the Federal Materials List or State Materials List and navigate from there. I'm going to click on Statutes and Court Rules and then the U.S. Code annotated. Once you reach the code, what you see in the main area is a list of the major subject areas the code is divided into. In the case of the U.S. Code, these are called titles. This is essentially your table of contents, but as I said in the previous tutorial, it's not all that helpful for searching unless you already know where you want to go. There's a search bar at the top that will let you run a search of the entire U.S. Code, but before we do that, I want you to notice the Tools and Resources list in the blue box on the right. In it, you can see two of the tools we talked about with print statutes, the index and the popular name table. Let's look at the index first. You can see that the index lists subjects alphabetically. Notice that it also lists names of acts with links to the popular name table. Let's say we want to look for the law passed by Congress that established a moratorium on evictions during the coronavirus pandemic. Navigate to the E section of the index to see if there's an entry for evictions. There is one, so I'll click on it. There are two entries under evictions that relate to COVID-19. One, which is specifically about the moratorium, links to Title 15 of the U.S. Code, Section 9058. The other, which is related, links to 15 U.S.C.A. Section 9057. Now that we've seen how the index works, I'm going to navigate back so we can look at the popular name table. There are a few ways we can search for the act we're looking for. It goes by the acronym CARES, or CARES, so we can search for that. We can also search for coronavirus, which is what the C in CARES stands for. Finally, the portion of the CARES Act that included the eviction moratorium was called the Coronavirus Economic Stabilization Act. Let's start with CARES. Notice that when I type it into the search bar, suggestions come up. I'm going to ignore those suggestions because they would all lead me to incorrect searches. Unfortunately, when I search for CARES in the popular name table, I do not get the Coronavirus Act, at least in my top results. I'll search for coronavirus instead. You can see that this is more successful, with results at number 1, number 9, and at 7, the Coronavirus Economic Stabilization Act. What the popular name table tells us is where each section of the public law was codified in the U.S. Code. You can see that the same results we saw in the index are listed here as well. But normally I wouldn't go to the index and then to the popular name table, so how would I know which section dealt with evictions? If I go back up to the top, I can click on the public law number. And then I can search the public law for the word eviction. The results of my search show me that the temporary moratorium on evictions is in section 4024 of the public law. I can now navigate back to the popular name table and correlate section 4024 with the correct section in the U.S. Code. So we've looked at the index and the popular name table, but in online databases, the best way to search a statutory code is often to use full text searching. And to do that, we put our search terms in the search bar at the top. Let's search for coronavirus and eviction. You can see that thanks to Westlaw's Relevance Rankings, section 9058 comes to the top of my results and 9057 is at number 2. Section 9056 is at number 3 and it looks like it may be relevant too. Let's look at section 9058. Once you're in a code section, Westlaw gives you a lot of information to explore. It shows you where you are in the code. Often, it will give you the effective date as well. It will also let you know that there is legislation pending in the legislature that could affect this section. At the top are important tabs. The Notes of Decisions tab will contain the case annotations, like we saw in print codes. This section doesn't have any because it's so new. The History tab will have a variety of materials that will tell you about the legislative development of the section over time. The history materials for the U.S. Code tend to be more extensive than they are for state codes. The Citing References tab is the heart of Westlaw's Citator. It lists cases, secondary sources, and other materials that cite the section of the code and tells you a little bit about what they say. The difference between the cases on the Citing References tab and those on the Notes of Decisions tab is that the ones on Citing References are generated by computer algorithms, whereas the ones on the Notes of Decisions tab are hand-selected by editors. The Content and Analysis tab provides further references that may give you more information relevant to this code section or the general area of law. At the bottom of the text of the statute, you'll find a section called Credits. In the credits, all the public laws that have contributed to the language of this section are listed. This one has only one public law, but some have many public laws and are very long. Below the credits is the currentness information. This information is similar to noting which edition of a print code you're using and going through all the updating pamphlets in print. Here, Westlaw is telling us that all the laws up to and including Public Law 116-158 have been codified. In other words, they've been added to the code. This does not mean that Public Law 116-158 changed this particular code section. In fact, we know it didn't, or it would be listed in the credits. Instead, it means that Public Law 116-158 has been put in the code wherever it belongs, and all we have to worry about now is whether any laws that were passed after 116-158 might have changed this section of the code that we're using. Notice that up at the beginning of the code section, there's a link that will jump you down to this currentness information. If you're interested in seeing the proposed legislation, you just click on the yellow flag. You'll see a list of pending bills and where they are in the process. Westlaw should remove these when this session of Congress ends. Notice that this information is actually on the History tab. Now let's look more carefully at the Citing References tab. By default, you'll see all results first, but you can use the options under Content Types on the left to change the view. Notice that Westlaw includes flags on the cases that cite the code section. This blue and white flag means that this decision is being appealed. Notice also that there are filters you can use in the Citing References tab. You can search within the results, you can change jurisdiction or date, or so on. Let's contrast what we've just looked at with 15 U.S.C. section 636. This section relates to the Small Business Administration. It was amended by the CARES Act, whereas the one we just looked at was added by the CARES Act. This means that Section 636 has been around a lot longer and has much more history, notes of decisions, and citing references for you to see. I want you to see the credits, or what's sometimes called the derivation note. So I'm going to click on this outline option, scroll to the bottom of the outline. That'll take me to the bottom of the text of the statute, and from there I'll go down to the credits. You can see there's a huge contrast between this derivation note and the one we saw on the earlier section. Back up at the top, if we look at the notes of decisions, you can see that they are divided into topics, and you can use those topics under table of contents to help navigate the notes of decisions. If you remember earlier when we were looking at 15 U.S.C. 9058, we talked about currentness. Let's look at it again here in section 636. This link will jump me down to it. As we saw earlier, all the laws up through Public Law 116-158 have been incorporated into the code. What about laws after that? How do we find them? I'm going to navigate back to the main landing page through the Westlaw Edge logo in the upper left. Here, click on Federal Materials, and then on Federal Proposed and Enacted Legislation, then on U.S. Public Laws, and then 2020. Scrolling down to the bottom of the list, I can find 116-158 and see that there are 5 other laws that have passed since then. I would need to look at these laws to see if they've affected evictions. Working with state statutory codes is similar. Let's look at eviction laws in New York as an example and find out what happens if a landlord tries to retaliate against a tenant. I'll start on the State Materials tab and click on New York. And then I'll scroll down to New York Statutes and Court Rules. Again, you can see that the index and popular name table are under Tools and Resources, and because it's New York, we've got the New York City municipal materials as well. Instead of using those tools, though, let's just do a full text search with keywords. Again, I'm going to ignore the suggestions because they would take me astray. They're going to other jurisdictions. This search gets me a variety of results, but I think I'm going to use this first one. It appears to be the most relevant. You can see that this looks just like what we saw with the U.S. Code. One thing I'd like you to see is the currentness. It looks a little different from what we saw with the U.S. Code because New York numbers its public laws a little differently. While I'm zoomed in, notice the arrows that let you navigate from one section to the next. Right next to these arrow buttons is the Table of Contents button, and this is important, and we didn't look at it when we were looking at the U.S. Code. The Table of Contents button pops open what I call a local table of contents, the table of contents that is zeroed in on the section that you're working with, and it's an easy way to navigate nearby sections and see what else you need to be reading. You should now have a basic understanding of how to navigate and search a jurisdiction's statutory code, how to locate historical information about a code section, where to find annotations as well as information from Westlaw's Citator, and how to use the local table of contents to find nearby sections that should also be read. This concludes Researching Statutes, Part 3, Basic Statutory Research in Westlaw. Please go on to the next tutorial in this series. If you have further questions, the reference librarians at the Jerome Hall Law Library are happy to help.